Congressman, what do you think of U.S. policy toward Cuba under Biden administration?
I'm very disappointed. I've long believed that we should normalize relations with Cuba. We should lift the embargo and treat each other as neighbors and get along. I pushed President Obama to open things up between the United States and Cuba, which he did, and I thought that was the right direction. And then when Trump became president, he reversed all of that, and in the last weeks of his administration, put Cuba back on the state-sponsored list of terrorism without any justification. And I had hoped that President Biden would, once he was sworn in, immediately reverse that and put us back on the track we were on when he was vice president and Barack Obama was president. That has not happened. I guess I would characterize my view of his policy toward Cuba as one of great disappointment.
What is stopping Biden to do something about Cuba?
These issues are really all about political will and priorities. He has it within his power to take Cuba off the state-sponsored list of terrorism. He can waive certain aspects of the Helms-Burton legislation so that we can deal with each other more constructively. But he hasn't done that. And I've urged him personally, I've urged the Secretary of State and others in his administration that we need to change course. And that hasn't happened yet. Again, I want them to change because it's the right thing to do. We have our disagreements with the Cuban government. Some of those disagreements are strong. During my many visits to Cuba, I've not hesitated to tell the Cuban government where I think that they are wrong. Having said that, we have a lot more in common. Our policy, which was one of economically strangling Cuba, is really hurting the people of Cuba. It's not hurting the government, it's hurting average people. And I don't think our policy should be about hurting average people.
Do you think that Biden's policy towards Cuba are more similar to Trump or Obama policy?
They're more similar to Trump, unfortunately, at this point. I've said to the administration that we can't just refer to this as the Trump policy. It is now the Trump-Biden policy, unless he decides to change it. President Obama understood the importance of changing course. I mean, we pursued a policy toward Cuba of economic embargoes and isolation for decades. It didn't help the Cuban people. It didn't change the Cuban government. It didn't do anything positive for anybody. It just caused misery. And I think President Obama realized that, it was time to change. And those changes that were made during his administration, I think, were helpful not only to the Cuban people, but helpful to people in the United States. This is not just about helping the Cubans. Americans can benefit too. I mean, families can, visit each other more often. We have agricultural interests in the United States that would like to trade with Cuba. I come from Massachusetts, where there's a lot of biotech companies, people doing medical research. Well, there's incredible medical research happening in Cuba as well. Our U.S. researchers want to collaborate more with the Cubans, and Cuban researchers want to collaborate more with the Americans. So we both have interests in pursuing a better relationship.
Could you explain me how the sanctions are affecting the U.S. citizens?
We can't do business in Cuba. U.S. citizens now have restrictions on their travel to Cuba. The American people want to know Cuba better, and I know the Cuban people want to know the American people better. So let's just do it. Let's get out of the way. Our policy right now is an embarrassment. It just doesn't work by any measure. Whatever the motivation was for instituting these policies, they have failed. They've failed miserably. I mean, we're isolated in the rest of the world in terms of still adhering to these old Cold War policies. I think it has not only resulted in hardships for the Cuban people, I also think it's diminished U.S. credibility on a lot of different issues regarding Latin America. And the whole issue of Cuba being on the terrorist list, I mean, it is just political. It is not based on merit, it is based on politics. Again, I disagree with much of the Cuban government's approach to human rights, but I disagree with a lot of other countries' approach to human rights. I even disagree with my own country's approach to human rights when I think we're wrong. But that's not the justification or a reason to put them on the state-sponsored list of terrorism. That's something that Biden can do right now. I mean, he can take them off that list. And I think if he did, that would be a step in the right direction, and that would ease up on some of the economic hardships that the Cubans are now facing. I mean, we deal with China. I mean, we deal with Saudi Arabia. I mean, we deal with, you name it, countries that are communist countries, countries that have human rights records that we disagree with, but we deal with them. That engagement gives us a bigger voice to have influence on issues that we care about. If I'm going to cut you off, if I'm going to isolate you, why should you listen to me? Why should you do what I ask you to do?
I can understand why U.S. government is treating Cuba different.
We clearly have a double standard when it comes to Cuba. There's no doubt about that. And I think much of the rationale for continuing this policy that has failed really has more to do with domestic politics than it does with what is a rational foreign policy. There's a significant and influential group of Cuban Americans who left Cuba before or right after the revolution, and who want to go back to the way it was when they were last there. And they have played a role in politics, especially in Florida and New Jersey. They, again, are influential, but I don't think they represent the majority of the American people. We should be asking, what is the right policy? What is the right policy for the United States, and what is the right policy for Cuba? And in my view, the answer is clear. We ought to normalize relations. We ought to lift the embargo. We ought to get Cuba off the state-sponsored list of terrorism. That doesn't mean we can't criticize each other. That doesn't mean we can't raise objections if we disagree with one another. But what it means is that we should have a normal relationship. My first visit to Cuba was in 1979 when I was a college student. The Cuba today is a very different Cuba than it was in 1979. And I would argue that there is more political space in Cuba today than there was in 1979. There is more entrepreneurial ventures than there certainly was in 1979. I think there's no denying that Cuba is different because of the increased interaction with the rest of the world. Things have changed out of necessity. I mean, the Cubans have had to adapt. We ought to encourage that. Cubans should decide what the future of Cuba is, not people here in Washington. But what we're doing right now is we're making it more difficult for Cuba to evolve, making it more difficult for Cuba just to put food on the table. There are shortages. I was there in December. Things seemed more difficult for average Cubans during my last visit in December than at any other time that I had visited Cuba, even during the special period. I'm going to continue to advocate that my government, that the Biden administration, reverse course and pursue a more rational, more mature policy toward Cuba, because it's in the interest of both our countries.
What can you do as a congressman to help to lift the sanctions against Cuba?
Ultimately, the way we're going to have to lift the sanctions is Congress is going to have to vote to overturn or end Helms-Burton. It's going to be more difficult to get Congress to change the Helms-Burton law because of, well, we have a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, and we have people over in the Senate who are Democrats who are in powerful positions who unfortunately favor the status quo when it comes to Cuba. But as we pursue that long-term goal of actually getting Congress to lift the sanctions permanently, the administration has enormous power to be able to ease those sanctions. There's a group of us who have been lobbying the administration very hard to change policies. And we've done so behind the scenes. But we're at the point now, I think, where we're going to have to be more public in our critique. We need to elevate the issue so that it's a priority, so that people are paying attention and people feel that they have to answer questions. We need to get the mainstream media to cover the realities of this situation between our two countries. I think anybody who looks at U.S.-Cuba relations objectively would say this is the wrong policy. I think U.S. policy toward Cuba is an embarrassment and a miserable failure. I think the time has come, after decades of this backward policy, to reassess and to say, it hasn't worked, let's try engagement.
Are more people like you in Congress? Because we knock a lot of doors and everybody seems like no open to talk about Cuba.
This is a political body, and people sometimes don't want to talk about things that might be controversial. They don't want to say what they really feel because they're afraid they might offend this chairman or that chairwoman. For them, it's just politically safer to say nothing. But as we speak, because of the hardships in Cuba, we see more and more Cubans coming to our southern border. And yet we have Republicans here in Congress who do not want to accept any more immigrants into this country. If you don't want people to come to the border, then maybe you ought to help address some of the internal challenges in the country of origin.
Right now, the situation in the border is causing a problem to the U.S.?
In the case of increased Cuban migration, more and more Cubans are coming here because people would prefer a more comfortable life than a life of hardship. And I think the ironic thing about all of this is that on one hand, we urge migrants not to come here unless they're, fleeing persecution. But on the other hand, we're creating the conditions in countries like Cuba where it's almost impossible for people to stay.
Do you think the sanctions are the major cause causing migration?
I think they're clearly a major cause. Not the only cause, but it's a major cause. No doubt about it. I talked to a lot of average Cubans when I was there in December, and they're wondering whether or not they have a future in Cuba. But these same Cubans desperately want to stay in Cuba because they want to improve the quality of life for the people in the country. Our policy is making it really difficult for them. And I think that's tragic. I mean, there's no doubt there's a connection between the sanctions and the suffering. This notion that that somehow the longer we keep sanctions and then the Cuban government will collapse. It's ridiculous. If the country of Cuba ever became a failed state, the impact on the region in terms of migrants and in terms of unrest would be enormous. Nobody should be cheering for that. If we care about human rights, I think easing up on some of these sanctions could create a climate where we can talk about our differences.
Are you hopeful about the future?
I am. The reason why I'm hopeful is because the status quo is wrong, and I think more and more people, when they focus on the issue, understand that, and that really the only way forward in a positive way is to change our policy. I want this administration to take some steps right now. I'm hopeful we'll ultimately get there. How quickly, I don't know, but I'm doing all I can to try to get this president to act as quickly as possible because it's the right thing to do.
How urgent is to move fast?
I think it's urgent. When you wait and wait and wait, then bad things can happen. There's a bill moving through the House of Representatives that would basically make it impossible for the president to take Cuba off the state-sponsored list of terrorism. It would tie taking them off the list to Helms-Burton, and that would mean that the president couldn't act on his own. This bill has already made it through committee, and I expect that we'll vote on it at some point on the House floor. I'm not sure we have the votes to defeat it, but we will try. But if that were ever to become law, that would move things back even further. So time is of the essence. The longer you wait, the more you give an opportunity to those people who really do not want a relationship with Cuba. We don't have a lot of time. This is an opportunity for out-of-the-box thinking, for some more engagement, and to start talking about what is it going to take for us to truly have normal relations between both of us.